Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. And today I'm delighted to have Orlando Patterson with me to discuss the relationship between slavery and freedom and slavery. Orlando holds the John Cowles Chair in Sociology at Harvard University. He was born in Jamaica a while ago.
A
Uh,
while ago.
oh, he's a every young guy. He lived there. His parent, his dad was. Let's see, your dad was a. I'm trying to see what. Quickly read through.
He's a police detective.
Police detective. Very interesting. And what did your mom do again?
Well, she is a
Dressmaker. And so he grew up. He got involved with. His parents were strong supporters of the People National Party. So he's been involved in the past in working with the Jamaican government. He got his BSc in economics, so with a concentration in sociology. So he's a fellow economist. He earned that from the University of the West Indies, Mona, in 19 something, uh,
62.
62. And that he served as president of the Economic Society. I think this is why we get along. Well, we're becoming fast buddies, as your economics background probably. But then he, got into president of the Literary Society and editor of the student magazine, The Pelican. Then he earned his Ph.D. in sociology at the London School of Economics. So here's the economics coming in again, but it's connected to sociology in another 1965. And he wrote a PhD thesis, a classic, The Sociology of Slavery. His dissertation advisor was David Glass. He's just, yeah, and he's so he's incredibly active. He has written a ton of academic books, but also novels. Uh, he's received awards, the Hegel Prize, the Barry Prize for Distinguished Intellectual Achievement from the American Academy of Sciences and Letters, the Order of Merit from Jamaica, the Ansfield Wolf Book Award, the Gold Musgrave Medal, the Warren Channing Cabot Faculty Prize at Harvard, the National Book Award for Nonfiction. That's a huge prize. The Walter Channing Cabot Faculty Prize at Harvard, I guess twice. American Political Science Association recognition. The Ralph Bunche Award from Howard University. I'm going through these because not everybody gets these kinds of awards. Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship from the American Sociological Association. Best Novel in English, The Children of Sisyphus, hard for me to say with my New Jersey accent, from the Dakar Festival of Negro Arts. And then the books that he's written, again, starting with the sociology of slavery, Black society in Jamaica. This was his PhD thesis. Ethnic Chauvinism, Slavery and Social Death, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, a very important book. The Ordeal of Integration, Rituals of Blood, Freedom in the Modern World, The Cultural Matrix, Understanding Black Youth, The Confounding Island, Jamaica and the Postcolonial Predicament, The Sociology of Slavery, Black Society in Jamaica, The Paradox of Freedom, a biographical dialogue with David Scott. And I'm going to have Orlando read from that. And then there's three novels, The Children of Sisyphus, An Absence of Ruins, Die the Long Day. So there's some combination here of Camus and Die the Long Day. It sounds like a James Bond title. And then he's written a ton of articles. Just go to Wikipedia, look up Orlando Patterson. He's one of a kind. He's one of our treasures, intellectual treasures in our country. And I asked him to come on because we are at a stage where I feel, and many others feel, and I think Orlando feels, that our freedom in our country is threatened by a would-be slave master in the form of President Donald Trump. This is not just somebody who's kind of been on not economically speaking, I'm to the right, socially speaking, I'm to the left, I guess, historically. But I was just reading an article from David Brooks calling for a quasi-rebellion. David Brooks is distinguished columnist from the New York Times, definitely a conservative, and he's saying these things. So we have Republicans. The Wall Street Journal sounds to me more liberal these days than the New York Times in many ways, the editorial page. But welcome, Orlando. I don't want to take the time. I want people to hear from you, not from me. Maybe you could start us off by, first of all, just reading the passage in this latest book, The Paradox of Freedom, the dialogue with David Scott and you about your work. But this paragraph on page 16 that he quotes of yours, if you could read that and maybe fill in anything that I left out of your bio, but then let's start addressing this question of how you see
Yeah,
freedom dissipating in our country and how it connects to your
sure,
research and your work over the years.
sure. This passage comes from the coda of my book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, which explores the origin of the idea, the value of freedom, and its relationship to slavery. So it's important, by the way, to note too that I take a position which is often contentious for folks on the left, certainly people concerned with world civilization. My view is that freedom is originated essentially in the ancient West, and for centuries was primarily, almost exclusively, a Western idea, an ideal. And many people find that idea disturbing and almost ethnocentric, arguing that freedom is universal. But that has to do with how I approach a subject. I should explain. There are two ways of approaching the attempt to understand freedom, and we can get into that, but I'd like to sort of lay it out from the beginning. There is the traditional philosopher's way, which begins with the assumption that freedom is inherent, that we all yearn for it, that we all have it. So to explore what it is, it's enough to sit in your armchair and probe deeply into the concept. That, as a historical sociologist, I don't agree with that approach. My approach is that all ideas emerge out of social context, often people struggling with each other, and then becomes, develops often by social thinkers and so on. But it's a social construct. It's not something buried deep in the heart of all human beings. And there are many cultures which do not even have a word for freedom. So anyway, that background is important. And in saying that, freedom is and was for millennia a Western idea, I'm not necessarily elevating or unduly praising the West at the expense of other cultures, because if you know how it originated, you will begin to agree with me that, well, maybe we're not that eager to sort of claim it, at least in its origin. So with that background, let me read this passage that you asked me to read, which comes from the coda of Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. The history of freedom.
Yeah, David Scott. I was just showing the copy of the book. Yeah.
Okay, it's originally from the book
Yeah.
Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, and David quoted
Yeah.
from that book in this work, which you just showed.
Yeah. Go
The
ahead.
history of freedom and its handmaiden, slavery, has bruited in the open what we cannot stand to hear that inhering in the good which we defend with our lives is often the very evil we most abhor. In becoming the central value of its secular and religious life, freedom constituted the tragic generative core of Western culture, the germ of its genius and all its grandeur, and the source of much of its perfidy and its crimes against humanity. So this is a, a very sort of mixed, if you like, view of freedom, but it captures what's essential about the idea, and that it was and remains the primary, certainly political value and ideal of the West. But that it's a complex, a very complex value, and has both good and bad aspects. And that's where I differ from most people who write on the subject. Or most people who write on the subject tend to see it as the preeminent good. And my argument is that they're both good and evil aspects of freedom once you get into its history. And I'm also saying, and perhaps we'll talk about this, that it explains why it is that so many bad things are pursued in the name of freedom, which is what we're going through right now in this country. Okay.
So, I mean, and the notion that freedom can only be understood in the context of slavery, I got the point that in order for us to understand the value of freedom, it's the slave who really understands the value of freedom. We have the stories of freedom interspersed of the creation of freedom interconnected with the story of slavery. If you think about Passover, the freeing of the Jews or slaves from Egypt, we go from slavery to freedom, and you can't separate the two. And do we get to total freedom? Is freedom ever 100%, or is it quasi-freedom? And can one lose freedoms kind of piece by piece, piecemeal, and end up in a state of freedom, but it's really
Yeah.
slavery? I think that's really the kind of concern we have today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my argument concerning the origins of freedom, why is it that this became such a powerful idea, and why did it happen in the West and for well over 1,500 years as primarily a Western value? So my argument is very simply that most people, most of the time, and most cultures tend to have other ideals which they consider important, whether it's religious ideals, worshiping the gods, nirvana, honor, glory in warfare, what have you. And in many cultures, when the idea is raised, people often sort of think that this is a very odd kind of idea among non-Westerners. I mean, that this comes up over and over when Westerners in cultures such as Japan, tradition, or even China, raise the question of what is freedom. Usually the first response is, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And let us imagine a missionary writing his dictionary of the Chinese language way back, or Japanese. And often the first response they get as they try to find out what is freedom in this culture is, we don't know what you're talking about. Explain to me what you mean. And the missionary would then explain this wonderful idea, which we're sure is in your heart, but you may not understand. The response typically is that, oh, that sounds like selfishness and indifference. And if you look at the literal translation of freedom, the original literal translation in Japanese, in Chinese, it often refers to something pejorative. But anyway, the idea as a powerful ideal to be pursued, which most non-Western people find odd, was the joint construction of enslavers and enslaved. It emerged from the unusual position that the slaves found themselves in, of total power over them, of life and death by one person over another, total degradation, total denial of any social connection to the society in which they exist, which then prompts the powerful desire for liberation, to escape from this as a personal value, which often is encouraged by the owner as one of the best ways of motivating the slave to work and to serve. So I trace this back to the first large-scale slave society, which is in ancient Greece, and show how, in fact, the concept developed and then was taken up by philosophers and refined, if you like, internalized by Plato, who said, well, that outer freedom you're talking about is sort of bonastic and not worthy of consideration. The really important freedom is the inner freedom. But he just transposed the external situation of master and slave to the inward life and soul, in which true freedom is mastery and control of one's impulses, control over what he calls the slave impulses. So he just sort of interjected the external idea. But then what emerged then were these two versions of freedom, inner freedom and outer freedom. And that's dominated Western thought ever since. But so what emerged eventually then at the heart of the idea of freedom, and this may no longer come as a surprise, is power. Power is central. And but there's good power and there's bad power. So there's three kinds of powers which are central to the history and I think continuing notion and experience of freedom. One is you're free to the degree that you have power over others, power over your condition, including power over other people. Now, that's sometimes disguised in various ways. It's sometimes just raw power. And the ancient Greeks and Romans, by the way, had no problem with the idea that you're free to the extent that you can exercise power over another people and over slaves and others. That's a master's view of power. That's the power, that's the sort of negative, or rather, today we see that as we're horrified by that idea. But it's important to remember that for most of Western history, the idea of freedom as having power over others was alive and well.
Let's talk about retirement for a minute. It's something Americans think about regularly. Ask yourself, how financially secure do you really feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is really enough? And if you don't have enough money, how can you possibly find that extra money before you do retire? These are all tough questions. My retirement software, Maxify Planner, is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. It weighs your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life based on when you decide to retire. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. It's accurate, easy to use, and produces what you really seek, peace of mind. So make the smart choice and visit Maxify.com today. Don't miss this opportunity. That's Maxify with an I, M-A-X-I-F-I, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. Say it another way, maybe that the freedom was the ability to enslave other people.
Yes, yes. And that is clear. I mean, in the Middle Ages, feudal lords And this idea of liberty, and this may, I always sort of, it's a horrible idea, but they spoke of the liberty of gallows, the liberty of the gallows, which means the liberty, the freedom I have as a lord to hang anyone in my domain who disobeys me. But this is not just a medieval idea. It's right here in America. If you just take a close look at our history, what was the South fighting for? The liberty, the freedom. No one spoke about freedom more than slave owners. But part of their freedom was the freedom to enslave Black people. Okay, so that was that side of freedom, which liberalism finds embarrassing and strongly rhetorically opposes, and we can get to that later on, is one important component of it. But even on the notion of power, there is a bad side and a good side. What we now see as the bad side is the idea of freedom as power over others. But there is an idea of freedom as power, which is also benevolent. And in many ways, Plato anticipated that when he spoke of true freedom as freedom to control one's impulses, control oneself, power over one's slave impulses. But it also means, in fact, empowerment. And that's an idea which feminists have strongly emphasized. So it is power, but the power to determine your life, the power to control, what you make of yourself. So the term empowerment is there. In a way, Amartya Sen's idea, and you as an economist will appreciate it because Amartya Sen has become one of the leading theorists of freedom in the modern world. But when he speaks of empowerment, when he speaks of capability, you know that word, that's the good side of power. Capability, control. It's not new. People talk as if it's new. It goes all the way back to Plato, if you like, and is a strong tradition of this, if you like, benign power, meaning power you have to control your life without, as John Stuart Mill, who strongly argued for this view too, pointed out, that power is fine as long as it doesn't interfere with the power of others, right? So power is not all bad. It has a bad side of control. It has a good side of control over your life, your destiny, what you become, empowerment. And it's a central idea in feminism and in the feminist view of freedom. There's a second concept of our idea of freedom, which emerged in the master-slave relationship too. And that was the freedom which the slave wanted more than anything else. And that was liberation, emancipation, freedom from. So the first freedom we just mentioned is freedom to do what you want with others or just with yourself. This second freedom, which emerged out of the slave condition, was the passionate desire just to be liberated from the control of another people. This is liberation, this is emancipation, and that negative freedom then. The first is freedom to do things, the second, liberation. But that second freedom also has a good and a bad side from the very beginning, as many people saw, as Epictetus, who wrote extensively on this, who was himself, of course, born a slave. And he saw the good side of it. Of course, he was happy to be emancipated, but he also saw the bad side of it. That is this idea of liberation, of escape, can also means a liberation into selfishness, liberation into not recognizing one's interdependence with others, liberation which does not recognize that one's liberty entails one's responsibility to the broader community and that you need that broader community. Liberation leading to complete selfishness and just me for myself.
Becoming of earning your freedom as a slave in the South, becoming a freedmen, and then potentially buying slaves.
Oh yeah, many
But
freedmen
then,
owned slaves, right? Yeah.
but then but then but then possibly, letting them earn their way out. So also having the freedom to free, as well as the freedom to enslave, because you have that
Yeah,
power.
yeah, but more importantly, just being concerned with oneself and not recognizing one's engagement, one's interdependence with the broader society. And that's the negative side of that's libertarianism, ultimately taken to its extreme, right? And then third, there's a third dimension of power, which is there from the beginning. And that is freedom in the sense of shared power. That is, your positive freedom and your negative freedom is really at risk if you do not have some control, some say in how the governance of your society is managed. And that, of course, is the origin of democracy. And it was there in the beginning. I mean, the Greek term, demos and kratos means literally people power. And that was central to the Greek idea of freedom, too, so, because they recognized that this positive freedom of power to do what you want, either over others or with oneself, this negative freedom to pursue one's aims independent of another person is at risk if you do not have some say in the control of the collective power that is the state. So that's the great thing about, and why I spend so much time studying. I'm a non-classicist, but I think everybody, I totally agree, and it's unfortunate that it's conservatives who are associated with this idea, but I totally agree that every educated person should spend some time studying ancient Greek and Roman society, because that's the origin of some of the most powerful value which we share today. So that, anyway, the important point is that central to the idea of freedom is power in these three senses, but each of which has both a negative and a positive side. And we can see it operating today now, except that, to anticipate what you may ask, it's the negative side of it's the evil side of freedom that seems to be threatening us now in our society, because democracy itself, like freedom as power, like freedom as liberation, democracy also had from the beginning in ancient Athens a good and a bad side. The good side, of course, is participation, having some say in the governance of oneself, which protects that personal freedom. But from the very beginning, the Greeks were aware of the fact that democracy has its evil side too, and that is exclusion. What I call the inclusive exclusiveness of ancient Athens is there from the beginning. The idea is that this democracy, this precious thing, belongs only to a certain group. And in the most ancient meaning of the term freedom is among the beloved, as distinct from those who are not among the beloved, who are the slaves. And from the very beginning, democracy had this idea which culminated in citizenship, meaning we who belong to this particular tribe or city-state or broader state, and citizenship always means an exclusive community of among whom this power is shared, but which excludes others. In Athens, of course, slaves and their descendants, the Meticos, were not included, but other people, non-Greeks, could never become citizens. So that idea of democracy as an exclusive group, an inclusively exclusive group, powerfully inclusive of those who are held to be citizens, to belong, but which excludes those who do not belong, And in fact, the sense of belonging and inclusiveness almost requires a strong commitment to the idea of clear borders for the exclusion of people from sharing in this wonderful thing, which only a select group of the beloved have. So that's the complex origin of this very powerful idea, which we call freedom, and which historically, as you can imagine, as I said, was exclusively a Western.
So take us, your book, The Freedom, the Making of Western Culture. Did I quote that right?
Yeah. Yes.
We get to a point where we have slave revolts.
Yes.
Going back to, again, the Exodus from the Bible, but we
absolutely
we have the Haitian revolt, the only successful slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere that leads then to the French Revolution, to some people believe.
It's connected, but it didn't lead to,
maybe led to our Civil War.
Yeah.
Because the South became too concerned about, or the Southerners became concerned the same thing would happen in the South. But in any case, it had ramifications. So how do we go from this freedom for a select few to the notion of freedom for all, freedom as a universal right?
Yes. That is what,
men are created equal.
Yeah.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
That is what's so radical, in fact, about the American and the French revolutions, and the idea of the rights of man, and which you can find origins of going way back to the Middle Ages. In fact, you find the idea in a nutshell as early as the Roman distinction between the laws pertaining to all human beings and as opposed to laws which relate to a particular state. The Romans are quite aware of that distinction. It sort of grew into the notion of natural law and I think from natural rights. So in other words, laws of pertaining to humanity as distinct from laws pertaining to a particular group. And through a long process, which many fine historians have traced, we had from natural rights emerging into the idea of human rights and the culmination of that in the Enlightenment. And ironically, one of the great ironies of history, although if you read my account of how freedom and laws emerge, it's not so ironical. The fact that the first declared set of principles on the rights of mankind, it wasn't the French Revolution, it was the Virginia Assembly. The French got the idea from the Americans, actually. People often sort of twist it around. But the very first declaration of such rights by a political entity came from the Virginia Assembly. Now, it doesn't surprise me.
Was that Jefferson who wrote that?
I'm trying to remember the name of the famous
Thomas Paine?
No. Paine. No. This is the name will come back, and I shouldn't. I'm having a senior moment, but it was the Virginia Assembly, who first sort of developed in a consistent way as a political document the idea of the rights of man as the sort of foundation of their own polity. And so Jefferson, of course, and it's not by accident to me, although many people are puzzled by the fact that the greatest defenders of the American Revolution and promoters of the rights of man, and of course, culminating in Jefferson's famous statement, and came from a bunch of slaveholders, large-scale slaveholders. Now, it doesn't surprise me at all. There's a remarkable parallel between Virginia and ancient Athens in that regard, because slavery and rather freedom emerge from that condition of slavery. And for the same reason, the Jeffersons and the Washingtons and are all aware of existentially the significance of freedom as the negation of slavery, because they could see, they live with it, they grew up with it. And so how could they live with that, the reality of celebrating freedom, but at the same time have large numbers of slaves? In the same way that the ancient Athenians did. And this is kind of the kind of democracy that emerged is, to use the German term, Herrenvolk, the folk, the superior folk democracy. That is to say, among us, the beloved, who are the only ones entitled to freedom. And so that idea, however paradoxical it may seem, is deeply rooted in the history of the West and goes back to the origins of freedom and democracy itself. So it did not surprise me, although it continues to surprise everyone who reads it. Why is it that the American Revolution and the most glorious declaration of our freedom comes from people who were large-scale slave owners? I hope that if you read my book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, it will complete. And of course, there's a famous debate, the Lincoln-Douglas debate. It's worth reading, because there was, in one of the debates between Lincoln and Douglas, who was a Southern slave master and who celebrated freedom, Lincoln threw up his arms and said, "I cannot understand this. How can someone be so celebratory of freedom, every second word is about freedom, and claim that they're fighting for freedom when they're enslaving people?"
What was Douglas's response?
Was that?
Do you recall what Douglas responded, or does he just?
Well, Douglas responded is that this is perfectly, and he was right. If you understand the nature of freedom, you'll realize that there are certain people for whom freedom, who are not fit for freedom, who must be led. They're like children. And we're like the fathers who sort of paternalistically
The ruling part, the ruling people, yeah.
Yeah, that's the Herrenvolk. And even the meanest among us, the poor whites, that is, are superior to this group so that's the explanation. It is the same explanation that the ancient Greeks had, the people whom they enslaved brutally and killed without the slightest compunction were seen as inferior. And the famous passage in Aristotle in which he describes and justifies slavery as certain people are born to be slaves. It's in their blood, it's inherent in them. So that was the rationale then, 2,500 years ago. It's the rationale in the South. And the South had history on its side, so to speak. Yeah, and the whole point of what's revolutionary about, Enlightenment and later the rise of liberalism is that it saw this as abhorrent, that whole idea, and this emphasis on the fact that one owns one's body. That is the most fundamental right. The ownership of your body, yourself, your being. And that, so slavery then is seen as a total abomination and the negative freedom, that is to say, the idea that, of not being under the power of another person, and the idea of your being under the ownership of another as the ultimate abomination was the central idea in liberalism. But if you want to, so you may ask, so the question then, how did liberalism then end up? I mean, that's became the sort of central idea in sort of 19th century capitalism. And so does that mean that the idea of freedom as power and a power over others is anathema to liberalism and to capitalism, which is the sort of political foundation of liberalism? No. Why? Because of a very interesting shift in thinking about what ownership and power over others mean. So, what is an abomination is the legal ownership of another person. That's a no-no, that's wrong, that's evil. Direct power over another person is evil. But there is something else which emerged in all of this. This is the rise, of course, in capitalism, involves the centrality or the sacredness of property. So it's wrong to have direct power over another person, to own another person. But if you, through your control of property, exercise power to another, that's fine. You know who first saw that idea? And that this is what? No, Marx. There's a famous passage in Marx in which he said that the great transition in the West came in the shift from the feudal order of control over property through direct control of human beings, the serfs and so on. That's how the Lord had power over the serf, and through that, through the control of his labor power and so on, he achieved his wealth. Shift from that to a situation in which power over property was the avenue towards power over people. It's a great passage in Marx, and but essentially that powerful insight is that we see that someone with just a signature, signing a contract, can, in a sense, remove the entire economic base, the factory, the farm, what have you, upon which a whole community depends, and send it all to China or Vietnam or what have you. You see what I'm getting at? That's power. That's total power in a way, because you've devastated the lives of people through your exercise over property. So the idea of freedom as power did not go away. In fact, if anything, it was strengthened under capitalism, but not direct power over people, ownership of people, but direct power over property and ownership of property, which allows you to do, to gut the whole Midwest, and so if you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so there's degrees of freedom, and freedom is the freedom to control, freedom to enslave, freedom to, but the limitations on freedom are evolving in your description, your narrative. Capitalism, at least there's a freedom to walk to a different path.
To do your freedom to go away, you can do anything you want. You have the freedom to starve.
Yeah. The soybean farmers in the Midwest right now don't have the freedom to sell their soybeans to China That's exercise of power,
Yes.
and by
And Lawrence, what I'm saying, this is sort of brings to what's happening now. The reason why, I mean, people are insisting that the abomination which we are witnessing in America is all being done in the name of freedom. Right? And this strikes many people as
freedom from
paradoxical.
a small minority that went overboard on wokeism, whatever, or
Yes, yes. But
natural,
doesn't it? Yeah,
whether have too many bathrooms, too many types of bathrooms, too
yeah,
much concern for people getting transgender people of different sexual backgrounds. This is being used as an excuse to
yeah,
basically to take away many of our freedoms, including the freedom of the economy. We
yeah.
have this compact that was just
Right.
issued by, in effect, the head of Apollo, a well-educated guy
Yes.
at the University of Pennsylvania. I think University of Pennsylvania should withdraw his degree, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
If-
But Lawrence, listen to what I'm saying. I'm saying they genuinely believe that this is a form of freedom, true freedom. Because let's take the whole anti-woke stuff, and essentially it goes back to the idea of who belongs to the beloved community of citizens, not those foreigners who have invaded our country. So the idea of ridding the polity of this infusion of outsiders, it goes all the way back, I mean, to the expulsion from the city state of inferior peoples who are not belonging to the superior Greek, culture and civilization, the Metics and so on, some of whom are tolerated as permanent resident, but never could become citizens. So that idea of the community of the beloved, which guards its borders, essential to one, if you like, primitive but integral idea of citizenship and democracy. So that again, I'm not surprised at this and of how successful Trump has been in motivating people who still have this primitive, strongly, like exclusivist view of what citizenship means, of what the polity means, of who has a right to belong, because it's ancient. It goes back, if you look in the Oxford, the big 14-volume Oxford Dictionary, the origins of the word freedom goes right back to this Indo-European scholars have been able to trace it back to it means among the beloved. And what Trump is doing is defining who constitutes the beloved. The beloved are white people, so South African whites can come in the same way that other Greeks could perhaps come in to the police, but not non-Greeks. And so that idea of associating the democratic polity with a select group of superior people, it's really back to the sort of the Southern antebellum, Southern Herrenvolk, superior race who are the only people entitled to citizenship. And as you know, Trump is the incredible thing about Trump is that he's explicit about his view. He's saying now that asylum, as well as the kind of people we're going to encourage to come to America, is going to go back to white people, beginning, of course, with white South Africans. So, but that idea is not new. It's one, if you like, version of what the polity consists of and who is entitled to be a citizen. It's an ancient idea. It's a primitive idea. It's a primitive.
yeah, is this when you say ancient, primitive, tribal comes to mind,
Yeah.
And think about the master race. They were trying to
Yeah.
have pure blood.
Exactly.
This is eugenics. This is my genes are better than your genes.
Yeah, it's a
Although,
eugenics came as a latecomer to of justifying it. I mean, Aristotle with the ancient Greeks didn't need eugenics to justify it. I mean, it was this idea, but it's the same idea that it didn't even necessarily mean that they were superior people. It simply means that it's almost like a blood kinship idea that, we white people constitute a distinct sort of tribe of people who are the people who created this great thing we call America, and it's being polluted by all these foreigners, and we need to restore the purity of the police of that's so the important point I'm making here is that democracy freedom is a complex viewed historically as, and it's the only way you really should view political and social ideas, is a very complex set of values, which has both a sort of a favorable part of it, which we celebrate, but which also, and you can't neglect the fact that there's a long history of this. And we're just going back to the Herrenvolk view of democracy, which is what prevailed in the antebellum South and in Jim Crow South. And, with a strong emphasis. I mean, why did they go out of their way to prevent blacks from voting? It's the idea that citizenship is a precious thing which belongs only to the master race or the group who created this culture and keep others out. And that's what we're back to now. America is for white people, and we're going to include the South African whites, and asylum will only go to whites, which is Trump's fantasy.
right. We're going to switch the immigration. Who gets the visas will be white people. I'd like to talk to you about a really powerful financial planning tool to help you make smart retirement and other critical financial decisions. It's a tool that factors in all your financial data and shows you what you can sustainably spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is my software company's Maxify Planner. It's incredibly powerful, it's accurate, and it's easy to use. Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Its focus is on raising, de-risking, and sustaining your living standard. Maxify lets you run what-if scenarios to see how your finances will change in taking new jobs, buying a home, doing Roth conversions, retiring early, downsizing, investing more in the market, you name it. Knowing the impact of these decisions before you make them is the secret to making smarter decisions. And it's also the secret to what we all seek, which is financial peace of mind. So please visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I, Maxify.com, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. I just a couple of comments here, tangential.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that Putin's invasion of Ukraine may have been a racial tribal move to bring more whites into Russia because the birth rate of non-whites is much higher. Asian people from is much higher inside Russia than white nations. And then the other thing that comes to mind is this book I told you about. I have to mention my uncle Herbert Stember, who was a sociologist at Rutgers.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Who is he? What's his name?
Herbert Stember. Charles Stember wrote a book called Sexual Racism.
Oh.
He argued that racism was inherently the fear of white men, that they would lose their white women to black men who were sexually viewed as superior, and that this explains why all these lynchings were connected to black men who were alleged to have interacted in some way, even talked to a white woman, and then 10 minutes later they're being lynched.
Yeah.
But there's something deeply ingrained here that's
To get back to Putin, it's consistent with what I said earlier, except that it may be related to population decline, but it maybe there, but there's something I think which better explains it, and he himself makes it clear too. That is, Ukraine was part of Greater Russia, part of that community, which is the Russian tribe, and that it was violated when they moved away. So in his case, it wasn't so much one of excluding the riffraff, the Latinos, the blacks, and so on. In his case, is that, something horrible happened to disrupt the unified tribe of the Slavic people. And he has, so don't forget Nazism itself. The Nazis themselves also had a similar idea of bringing all the, as you know, Germans had migrated all over Europe. And part of their ideal was not just to exclude the people who did not belong, particularly the Jewish people, but also homosexuals and others, but also to bring back the people who had been scattered all over in Czechoslovakia and Russia and Poland and so on. So there's all that same idea of the beloved community is what motivates bringing people of the same race, tribe, and so on together. And that's what Putin is doing. He claims that there's a horrible disruption of the great Russian Slavic nation, and he's bringing it back to it. So the two, it's the same kind of thought. One involves expelling the riffraff from the purity of the group, which is Trumpian immigration policy, but it also means bringing back the great sort of reconciliation of the fellow tribesmen who are scattered all over. We're going to bring them back together.
Let's think ahead here, where things are heading. We have a low birth rate in general, fertility rate of 1.6, but in the country, but the fertility rate of non-whites, blacks, Latino, Asians. If we fast forward, I haven't seen the latest projections, but as of a couple of years ago, the projection was that in 2050, the majority of the country would be non-white. And I don't think that these moves by Trump on the immigration are going to change that destiny of this country. Now, we could have that segment of society being enslaved again, and de facto, if not de jure. How do you see the future of the country with respect to freedom?
Lawrence, okay, I'm glad you raised that, because my ideas again are different, although okay. I think the demographic claims which Democrats and people who claim to be more on the left were claiming was both provocative and wrong, and simply excited and generated the kind of racist counter attack in terms of getting rid of the riffraff and the fantasy that what the Democrats are really trying to do is to increase the number of non-Anglos.
The replacement
theory. Now,
let me just say that the notion of the replacement theory is that there's kind of some conspiracy for this to happen. What's really happening is just natural.
I know. But let me explain. They're both wrong. But let me explain what's really happening. If you look at the figures, at what's going on, right? The idea that by 2050, whites will be outnumbered by non-whites is just not true. Why? Because of a simple error which is being made on the left, which is to assume that all Latinos, or Latinx, as some academics prefer to call them, are non-whites. That's not true. Just thinking in terms of how they define themselves and of how historically so-called Latinos and their ancestors were defined. A large number of them, most of them, came from a place called Spain. Spain is an inherent part of the white Western culture. And a large number of, and in many of the cultures, the majority of the people in Latin America consider themselves white. Certainly that's true in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, although that's changing quite interestingly in Puerto Rico, is no longer the case. But it's true in Venezuela, it's true in Colombia, and so on. So essentially what we have is a situation, just look at the Cuban population. They consider themselves white, and correctly so, by the way, because a large number of the Cubans who came here were descendants of the Cuban elite, the majority of whose grandparents came not even in the old colonial period, but in the late colonial period, in the late 19th century. Castro's grandparents came from Spain. So look, it's ridiculous to claim that we're having, as the left sometimes claim, and as the right, scared to death by what the left is saying, also claiming being replaced. No, if you look at the actual data, the census data, in which, as you know, there's an elaborate set of questions about how you define yourself, whether it's a single race or more than one race, and what's your main race, or are you race alone? The majority of Latinos describe themselves as white alone. And correctly so, as far as my history goes, because they are direct descendants of Spanish people who, to the best of my knowledge, are considered white. And the more conservative they are, the more they tend to define themselves as white. But also, what I'm saying is that they have a higher birth rate, yes. And when we look at the definition of their self-definition, their racial self-definition, second generation, third generation, what have you, the more assimilated they are, the more they define themselves as white. Conclusion, it is not, it's only if you assume that all Hispanics, define themselves as non-white, and that, therefore, given their birth rate, they, along with blacks and other non-whites, will constitute majority, but that ain't so. Because the more assimilated they are and the more successful they are, the greater the tendency for them. So the white population is going to remain the majority, and the substantial majority, right up towards the last decades of this century.
Let me ask you a related question here, which is...
But you see what I'm saying? You see how sociological and misconception. So the left is saying, oh yeah, that's going to happen. The right is saying this is a replacement effort on the part of the left. They're in a way both wrong in the sense, but by emphasizing the non-white nature of Latina and exaggerating, you can't understand why so many voted for Trump. Okay, sorry. Yeah. I think it's important.
Just a connected question, which is, to what extent are we seeing as people assimilating and as intermarrying, where the distinctions are kind of disappearing?
Yeah.
John, you're the sociologist. Are you seeing that happening in the data?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, the Black population intermarriage is increasing, especially among men, tremendously. And so I'm not saying that the mixed population is not growing. It is, and growing substantially. And eventually, maybe in the next century, you may get to the point where the mixed population is in the majority. But a lot depends on how they define themselves. I'm simply saying that the idea that by 2050, the majority of the population is going to be defining themselves as non-white is simply not the case. But yeah, you do get a significant amount of intermarriage, intermixing among Asians. Among Asian women is very high, perhaps the highest. Among Latin American, Latina women, it's also high. It's relatively low among Asian men. Among Black men, it's increasing quite substantially. As a matter of fact, a high proportion of middle-class Black men are now in mixed marriage. And
20%?
What's that?
What percent would you say?
It's well over 30%. On the other hand, it's much lower among Black. By the way, here's a little interesting little side fact. It's the opposite in Britain. Its intermarriage rates are much higher among Black women and white Englishmen than it is between Black men and white women in Britain. It's the opposite here. They are fascinating
Just repeat that again. Just say that again. The intermarriage rates are what?
Intermarriage. Okay, which gender is marrying in out? In America, it's black, especially middle class black men who are marrying out. Okay, with whites and Hispanics. In Britain, it's the opposite. It's black women have a much higher rate of out marriage, of mixed marriage with
Yeah.
white men, as opposed to black men marrying white women. It's an interesting. There, I have an explanation for it, but it'll be too great to digression.
So since let me bring this to a kind of a concluding section or segment, because we're almost into an hour here.
Yeah.
Maybe even over, but it's so fascinating. We could talk all day. How do you see things proceeding? You know, one theme I think that I get from your work, and I haven't read almost, just really skimmed it, Cliff Notes, okay? Is that at some point the oppression becomes so strong that people view sacrificing their life to attain freedom as required. That and this brings, some of your work connects to Camus. And so I mean, there's a whole, you should read these books and novels. They are very deep. And once I retire from being an economist, this is on my top of my reading list. But tell us a little bit about how you see things evolving. Is this going to be just a gradual erosion of our freedoms? Bing, 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 bing.
Camus was a great influence on me in my younger days. My very first novel was inspired by the myth of Sisyphus. Like, in fact, the very title, The Children of Sisyphus, comes straight out of Camus. But the work of Camus you're referring to here is The Rebel. The Rebel. And The Rebel opens with the image of the slave. And the question he asked is, the slave has been oppressed all his life, is sort of has no rights, but he revolts. And he said, at what point and what motivates the slave ultimately to say no as the wretch? And that's how Camus opens his discourse. It's a great discourse on resistance and freedom. And what you're asking me, in a way, is a version of that question which sort of motivated the opening reflection of Camus' The Rebel. At what point do people say no? Okay, and choose to resist? At what point does rebellion set in? In a way, we already see it happening. Rachel Maddow is very good in pointing out, and in fact, it's sort of it's a little bit of a lift from a day of depressive news to hear her telling us that, there is risk. And of course, tomorrow, we'll see tomorrow what happens. People are resisting.
No King's Day.
No King's Day. But look, you see it also.
Administrations.
Let me get back to this idea that the beloved, the citizen, is a white American. And you can simply grab someone who looks Hispanic, who has been here almost all his life, certainly all his or her adult life, working, paying taxes, and so on. A lot of ordinary Americans, including increasingly people who define themselves as Republican and so on, are beginning to say, look, there's something wrong here, because these people are among us. They're part of us. They've been living here and become American.
I'm a third generation. I don't know how were you.
I'm a first generation, so I see myself.
Everybody's an immigrant in this country. None of us are Native Americans. None of us.
I know. But for Trump, it's ironical. Trump's mama was an immigrant. You know that. His mother comes from Scotland. What?
If Stephen Miller's policies, he's the deputy advisor.
I know.
His policies were in place when his great grandfather got here.
I know.
He would be in a parallel universe. He would not be alive.
I know. I can't figure you explain him to me, okay? I don't figure him out.
He's
There
what we
were
call, he's what
huh?
we call a shunda in Yiddish. Means a disgrace, an embarrassment, despicable.
I know.
Disrespectful.
It's sad. I just shake my head, and I guess we had our Uncle Toms among black people too, but that his case is extreme because he sounds like a fascist. He's a bloody fascist. I mean, the things he says. But anyway, but no, to answer your question, my sense is that there's growing sense that this is wrong. That's what's going on is wrong among ordinary people. I mean, not only among us academics and middle class sort of readers of the New York Times. What I'm seeing in these people, I take a close look at the people who are coming out and demonstrating, and they're ordinary people. And, so there is a strong sense in which the Herrenvolk idea of citizenship has been rejected. A significant minority of people, the MAGA crowd, still have it. And when and not just the MAGA working class, but the recent exposure of the conversation among the young Republicans indicate that racist ideas are still percolating among people whom a lot of us thought a younger group of Americans had more or less gone beyond racism and anti-Semitism. But Jesus, that was, but it's a minority. And so this is the optimist in me, this hardcore Herrenvolk idea that we, the superior white race of people, are the only people entitled to citizenship, is, I think, a minority. It's a minority that is hardcore and that Trump has been able to coalesce and align in a very strong, and then using the primary system to control the Republican Party. But my sense is that it is a minority and that ordinary Americans, not academics, not intellectuals, not readers of the Times, but just ordinary Americans feel in their guts that there's something wrong about an ICE agent coming and just grabbing someone off the street who has been living here, contributing, becoming and consider themselves American. So I see that. I take, some, satisfaction from that. And my sense is that it's going to be, and it will be reflected. Well, the big test of this, Lawrence, is going to be next year, November. I mean, my prediction, and you can come back to me next year, is that there's going to be a landslide in the elections, even if Trump gets away with gerrymandering seats. I think there's going to be a landslide. That's going to be the end of it. But I'm an optimist. I may be completely wrong. What do you think? What's your sense?
I think I'm an optimist too. I'm very worried, but I'm an optimist, and I think this was a great place in which to bring this to an end and a thank you, because this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think you're the future leader that we need in this country. You're almost old enough to run for president. So, and I'll be happy to be your vice president.
Oh, gosh, yeah, okay. We don't want any more old men running this country, I can tell you that.
I think you're a young man in a older form.
Yes.
Anyway,
well, I'll take that. Thank you very much. It was great talking with you, Lawrence. And
it was a pleasure.
hope to
Thanks
see
again.
you.
And
Okay.
we'll
Take
be in
care.
touch.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.